to our first Land Center Luncheon of the semester. I'm so glad that y'all are here to join us. I hope you're enjoying your lunch. My name is Evan Lino. I'm the director of the Land Center here at Southwestern, and so this is a wonderful opportunity for you to be here and learn and be exposed to some ideas that will help complement some of the things that you're learning in class. So before we get started, let me ask the Lord's blessing on our meal and our time together, and then I will introduce our speaker. Father, we come into your presence today, thanking you for the opportunity to invest these days that we are here at Southwestern in learning your word and applying it to life, and particularly today as we think about the family and the impact that the family has on society, and particularly within the American society. Lord, I pray that we would be able to take the things that we learned today and apply them not only in our own lives, but to see how they impact our churches, our neighborhoods, and the larger culture in which we live. Father, we ask now that you would give Dr. Carlson wisdom as he speaks to us. Lord, we also ask that you bless this food that we're enjoying. In Jesus' name, amen. Well, today our speaker is Dr. Allan Carlson. If you were in chapel, you heard Dr. Patterson introduce him briefly. But Dr. Carlson is an author, a professor, a historian. He is a graduate of Ohio University with his PhD in modern European history. I know Dr. Carlson from his time at the Howard Center. He is the John A. Howard Distinguished Fellow for Family and Religious Studies, as well an editor of the Natural Family Journal. My interaction with Dr. Carlson has primarily been through the World Congress of Families, an organization that he started back in 1997, and they have had meetings related to the impact of the natural family on society all over the world. I've been with them in Warsaw, Poland, and Tbilisi, Georgia, and Salt Lake City, Utah, and they've had meetings in Spain, Mexico, and a host of other countries around the world. Dr. Carlson's most recent book is a book entitled Family Cycles, Strength, Decline, and Renewal in American Domestic Life. And so this is the topic of his lecture today is really built upon some of the ideas that are found in this book. Now, at the end of our time together today, we're going to have a Q&A, so you'll have the opportunity to ask Dr. Carlson some questions. As we have done traditionally at our Land Center events, we have a few giveaways. So we have 3 copies of Dr. Carlson's book, as well as a $50 gift certificate to the Seminary Hill Bookstore. So for the 3 best questions of the day, the best question will get a book and the gift certificate, and the other 2 will get a copy of his book. So please be thinking through what question you would like to ask Dr. Carlson. But it really is a pleasure to have Dr. Carlson here. I think, as Dr. Patterson said, he's one of the leading voices in the world on the family, and this is fitting for what we at the Land Center want to see happen here, be exposed to the ideas here at Southwestern. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Allan Carlson.
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. I thank Evan for arranging it, and I thank Paige and Dorothy Patterson for being such good friends over the years, and it's a delight to see Dr. Patterson this morning. Up north, where I come from, you still sometimes hear jokes about Ole and Lena. They're mythical Swedish Americans who settled in northern Illinois or Minnesota or the Dakotas, and who are notable for their dysfunctional marriage. I recently heard a new story. Ole is now 97 years old. Lena is 96. And they go before a judge seeking a divorce. The judge is perplexed. Ole, Lena, you've been married for nearly 80 years. If I get a divorce now? Ole answers, well, Judge, we decided to get one long ago, but thought we should stay together until all of our children were dead. Alas, today, a joke of this sort commonly induces at best nervous laughter. This is because such tales work best and well only within a healthy culture of marriage and family life, where we can laugh because it is mostly fiction. Certainly, the status of the family in America in the early 21st century is no laughing matter. The nation's marriage rate is at an all-time low. The average age for first marriage is near 30 for men and 27 for women, unprecedented high numbers. It appears likely that a third or more of current young adults will never marry at all. The birth rate in the United States is near the historic low. Over 40% of the births that do occur are outside of marriage. The divorce rate is stubbornly high. Most recently, we have witnessed a curious rise in so-called gray divorce, couples married 25 years or more who are calling it quits. Consider Oli and Lena. Meanwhile, over the last 50 years, a series of federal court decisions and legislative acts have deconstructed, have stripped down the legal protections and supports that had bolstered the married couple, child-centered, procreative, natural family. However, if we examine the American past, a more interesting and possibly more promising story emerges. My recent book, which Evan introduced, Family Cycles, Strength, Decline, and Renewal in American Domestic Life, 1630 to 2000, identifies 4 100-year episodes in American history. Each of these cycles involves about 50 years of evident family strength, followed by about 50 years of family disruption and decline. Periods of strength occurred, again, roughly speaking, from 1630 to 1680, the commonly mocked era of the Puritans in New England. From 1730 to 1780, the critical decades consummated by the American Revolution. From 1830 to 1880, America's misunderstood Victorian age. And from 1930 to 1970, the time of the iconic baby boom. These periods of strength all involved early marriage, an average age at first marriage of near 20 for women, 23 for men. Nearly universal marriage, where about 95% of all adults sometime married. High fertility, where the nation seemed to be swarming with children. Close attention to parenting. Complementary gender roles, which built positively on the real differences between men and women. Flourishing small home economies, and stability, meaning relatively few divorces. During periods of weakness, we find delayed marriages, more never married adults, lower fertility, smaller families, and other signs of a retreat from children, more divorce, a loss of family economic independence, and weakened homes. Such episodes in the American past can be found from about 1680 to 1730, an era of crisis in Puritan New England, exemplified by the Salem witch episode. From 1780 to 1930, the troubled early decades of the American Republic. From 1880 to 1930, when the stresses of the urban industrial revolution disrupted American family life, and from 1970 to the present, our current time of family meltdown. As near as I can tell, these cycles are unique to the American experience, certainly when compared to the history of Western Europe. The demographer J. Hajnal has described a very different and consistent marriage pattern among the Europeans, clearly evident since 1700, and probably there before. It has involved a high average age for first marriage, a high proportion of adults who never marry at all, about 1/3, and relatively low fertility. Indeed, viewed another way, during cycles of decline, the family lives of Americans have come to resemble the European model. It is in the periods of renewal and strength that Americans have become distinctive, different. This concept of family cycles challenges existing theories of social history. It rejects the liberal view that change in American family life over the last 400 years involves the growing triumph of the individual and the steady decline of the family. It denies the Marxist view that the bourgeois family of the capitalists is unstable and fated to be replaced by a socialist family form where the state takes full responsibility for children. In recent decades, still another theory of family change has emerged, this time among feminist historians. They say that a love revolution has occurred. They say that the family institution is no longer focused on the begetting of children and the preservation of family property. Rather, marriage and family living now center on flexible lifestyle choices designed to fulfill each individual's emotional and sexual desires. In this view, children are no longer central to family life. Indeed, in a pursuit of sexual pleasure, one is better off without them. My thesis rejects that argument as well. Still, you might respond, okay, Dr. Carlson, this may be all well and good, but why should I care about a theory of history? Two responses. First, a theory of history is critical to our identification as a people, a commonwealth, a nation. In this case, are we Americans atomized, pleasure-seeking individuals, or are we devoted to natural social bonds, to motherhood, to kin, to faith communities? Second, such ideas do bear consequences. In recent years, for example, the advocates of same-sex marriage, from former President Obama to the great majority of journalists and academics, have routinely claimed that they are on the right side of history, while defenders of traditional or natural marriage are on the wrong side of history. Such arguments rely on tangled versions of the liberal, Marxist, and feminist theories that I have just briefly outlined. More importantly, perhaps, state and federal judges ruling in recent marriage cases commonly appeal to these same theories of history, rephrased as social evolution. Typical was Judge William Downing's language in his 2004 decision striking down Washington State's Defense of Marriage Act. He wrote in his opinion, "As time marches inexorably on, human society evolves." If my argument is correct, though, it is Judge Downing and others like him who may be on the wrong side of history. My full argument for a cycles theory of America's social past rests in the book. In the concluding chapter of that volume, though, I identify 8 underlying factors that were common to all 4 episodes of family strength. In outlining these 8 common factors or causes, I will also offer specific examples of each of them at work. I so hope to illuminate aspects of the American past that may seem new and unusual because they have been deliberately distorted or hidden. The first common source of family strength has been the dominance of a family-centered worldview. In the 19th century, again from about 1830 to 1880, a remarkable effort emerged to construct a rich and sweeping ideology of the family. At the theological level, a key leading figure was Horace Bushnell. In his popular book, Christian Nurture, he strove to rekindle a great and momentous truth, the organic unity of the family. Rejecting the modern notion of individualism, Bushnell stressed the extraordinary power of the spirit of the house in guiding children toward good living and salvation. As he summarized, understand that it is in the family spirit, the organic life of the house, the silent power of a domestic godliness, working as it does unconsciously and with sovereign effect, that it is which forms your children to God. Giving practical content to this American version of Victorian ideals, named after Queen Victoria of England, was what novelist Nathaniel Hawthorne called, and I quote, "a damned mob of scribbling women." Female writers who actually dominated American publishing in the Victorian age. They included Catherine Beecher, eldest daughter of the famed Beecher family, and the author of 24 books and hundreds of articles on the education of women, theology, and the home economy. Sarah Joseph Hale, the editor for over 40 years of the hugely influential journal Godey's Ladies' Book and Ladies' American Magazine. And Lydia Huntley Sigourney, the mother of a large family, who, in her leisure time, wrote 67 books, including a dozen collection of her poems, and over 2,000 articles for 300 different periodicals. Their common themes were the existence of separate spheres of activity for men and women, the role of the home as the domestic church, and a stress on true womanhood. Allow me one specific example of their remarkable work. In her 1838 book, Letters to Mothers, Lydia Sigourney actually laid out the arguments for homeschooling children, arguments identical to those picked up 150 years later by current homeschooling parents. Common objections to the practice and Sigourney's responses include too little time. Her response, 2 or 3 hours of study a day would be all that the first 8 or 10 years of life would need, and much more than they usually obtain. I have too much to do. Her response, and my wife likes this one, do not be too ambitious a housekeeper. Energy and adherence to system will accomplish wonders. Children require the stimulation found in schools. Her response, is this not merely another name for envying and strife? Sigourney concluded, let us keep our children for our own during their earlier years. The world will have them long enough afterwards. The second common source of family strength has been the dominance of communitarian ideals, where the claims of the community often take precedence over the wishes of the individual. As historian Larry Gregg summarizes, the 17th century Puritan project in America sought, and I quote, to create a society of closely knit Christian villages with a strong sense of communal responsibility, a Christian utopia. In another historian's judgment, these Puritan villages were small, intimate, and essentially cooperative places, guided by everlasting love and operating on the principle of good neighborliness. We heard about that today, didn't we? A third historian, Kenneth Lockridge, shows how the Puritan founders of these Christian utopian corporate communities set out to construct a unified social organism in which the whole would be more than the sum of the parts. Remarkably, he adds, between 1630 and 1680, they succeeded. This communitarian ideal gave particular focus to the procreation and nurture of children. The first 2 generations of Puritans in America averaged about 9 children per couple, most of whom survived to adulthood. The New England climate actually proved to be good. Sometimes the results were more striking. In the Massachusetts village of Billerica, founded in the 1650s, there were 26 families with 10 children each, 20 families with 11 children, 24 families with 12 children each, 13 families, each with 13 children, 5 families with 14 children apiece, 1 family with 15, and 1 with 21. Taken together, Billerica counted 90 families with 1,043 children, an average of 11.6. This kingdom of children stands as a classic example of natural fertility, which is the family size associated with early marriage and the conscious rejection of birth control. The third common source of family strength over the centuries has been widespread property ownership among families, especially in homes and farmland. Between 1730 and 1780, prior restraints on American colonial expansion, notably the threat of attacks by Indians and by the French, disappeared. The quick settlement of Pennsylvania was exemplary. Believing that farming was the least corrupted of professions, William Penn implemented a land distribution scheme to encourage husbandry, another name for farming, and to allow, as he put it, for the more convenient bringing up of youth. Or, as another early settler put it, abundant land in Pennsylvania created a setting where tender plants, their children, might grow in the truth, involving an intensified form of child-rearing. Observers at the time were struck by the ease with which 18th century American colonists could acquire a land and build a house. In 1748, for example, the Swedish Academy of Science sent economist Peter Kalm to visit the colonies of Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and New York. He reported that good, uncultivated land was so abundant that a new married man can, without difficulty, get a spot of ground where he may sufficiently subsist with wife and offspring. In his 1755 essay, no less a figure than Benjamin Franklin agreed that land was so plentiful and cheap in America that a laboring man that understands husbandry can, in a short time, save enough to purchase a piece of new land sufficient for a plantation whereon he may subsist a family. Indeed, the family effects of property ownership were large. Again, looking now at the 18th century. Marriage came early, an average age for first marriage of about 20 for women, although in frontier regions the average was closer to 17, and age 23 to 24 per men. One local census in the South Carolina Hill Country found that among 17,000 white adults, there was not a single woman at age 25 who was neither wife nor widow. All had married, the result of a culture where every signal, religious, economic, and social, pointed young folks to matrimony. And the fertility of those 18th century colonial Americans was stunning. Again, an average of 9 children per family, the great majority surviving to adulthood. A visitor from Germany, schoolmaster Gottlieb Mittelberger, reported in 1754 that the female sex in this new country is very fruitful. Whenever he met an American woman, she is either with child, or she carries a child in her arms, or leads one by the hand. The Anglican itinerant minister, Charles Woodmason, came to the hill country of the Carolinas in 1760 to preach to those he called the most lowest, vilest men breathing, Scotch-Irish Presbyterians. He was astounded, though, by the number of children that he found. In many cabins, you will see 10 or 15 children, children and grandchildren of one size, and the mother looking as young as the daughter. Yet these poor people have good health. In 1775, Harvard University theologian Edward Wigglesworth calculated that through births alone, British Americans had doubled their numbers every 20 to 25 years, drawing a conclusion that has been confirmed by modern demographic historians. Wigglesworth called this a rapidity of population increase not to be paralleled in the annals of Europe. Indeed, he continued, such a thing has never been equaled since the patriarchal ages of the Old Testament. Why? Among the reasons that Wigglesworth gave were the boundless tracts of new land, which allowed every new married couple and their children to gain by their industry a comfortable support. Projections of the time showed that within a few decades, the burgeoning number of colonial Americans would result in a larger population than found in the mother country, Great Britain. It is clear that a sense of demographic destiny gave courage to patriots in their challenge in 1776 to the world's greatest empire over issues of taxation, cross-mountain settlement, and trade. The fourth common source of family strength has been the existence of strong family economies. That is, a conscious commitment to homes rich in function. According to historian John Demos, the 17th century family in Puritan New England was first of all a business, the absolutely central agency of economic production and exchange. Each family strove by intent for a high degree of self-sufficiency. The labor by man, woman, and children alike was a wholly natural extension of family life. The Puritan family was also a school and a vocational institute where the young learned to read, write, and do sums, and later on acquired the other skills necessary to adult life, often through apprenticeships. Puritan girls were notable for their high degree of literacy, an example of what their leaders called parental ministry. The New England home was also a church, featuring daily devotions, Bible studies, and home worship led by the fathers. These homes served as well as welfare institutions, hospitals, orphanages, retirement homes, and even centers of correction. That is, the idle and petty lawbreaker could be sentenced to serve a responsible family as a servant. The fifth common attribute found in cycles of family strength has been a strong middle class. During the period 1930 to 1970, the era of the marriage boom and the baby boom, this development took the form that economists call the Great Compression in wages. Income inequality in America sharply declined, with the income difference or differential between the top 10% of earners and the bottom 90% narrowing dramatically. Part of the cause were the high marginal taxes placed on the wealthy and the wage and price controls introduced during World War II. For example, these war measures commonly restricted wage increases at the higher levels while granting raises to employees receiving substandard wages. All the same, the primary factor, the major factor, in the words of economists Claudia Golden and Robert Margo, were market forces that increased the demand for less skilled manufacturing workers. During these years, immigration into the United States was sharply controlled. War production and the post-war economic boom, which lasted from about 1945 to about 1970, made this a golden age for American factory workers. These were the unionized, blue-collar breadwinners who, by the millions, made the leap into the middle class, complete with a suburban home, a homemaking wife, and children they could afford. The sixth common factor behind a strong family system has been a family-centered polity or government. In each case, in all four episodes, law and public policy strove to defend and encourage the married couple, child-rich home. During the same era just mentioned, from 1930 to 1970, federal public policy became decisively and deliberately pro-family. This is something many conservatives don't want to hear, but I'm going to proceed anyway. Most surprisingly, a fair review shows that the whole of the domestic New Deal, Franklin D. Roosevelt's anti-depression program, strongly favored marriage, the payment of family wages to fathers, support for full-time mothers at home, the ownership of homes and land, maternal breastfeeding, and the birth of more children. Pushing these values were a group called the maternalists, mainly women, including Frances Perkins, U.S. Secretary of Labor, Grace Abbott on the Council on National Security, Catherine Lenrud, Chief of the U.S. Children's Bureau, part of the Department of Labor, and Mary Anderson at the U.S. Women's Bureau. A specific example of their handiwork were the Social Security amendments of 1939, which created a homemaker's pension for women married to qualified men, and fairly generous survivors' benefits for widows and orphans. To choose another example, the National Housing Act of 1934 introduced the long-term amortized 30-year mortgage on the national scene, along with federally subsidized insurance against default. Over 98% of federally guaranteed loans went to young married couples buying their first house. At the end of World War II, such measures stimulated the suburban revolution. By 1960, a mere 15 years later, the number of owner-occupied homes in the United States had doubled. Such policies help explain why evangelicals in the South, like Roman Catholics nationwide, tended to vote Democrat in these years. It was arguably the party of the family. Meanwhile, federal income tax policy also became very family-friendly. A technique of tax calculation called income splitting, introduced nationwide in 1948, broadly favored marriage and transformed full-time homemakers into valuable tax shelters. The increase in standardization of the personal income tax exemption lifted whole families with 3 or more children at the median income level, lifted them completely off the federal tax rolls. These laws and public policies contributed to amazing results. By the 1960s, just as in the 1660s, the 1760s, and the 1860s, almost all American adults were or had been married. Early marriage returned as well. By 1956, the average age of first marriage was again 20 for women, 22.5 for men. Fertility soared, with the birth rate almost doubling between 1933 and 1957. The fertility increase was even greater among college-educated women, so defying a so-called law of sociology, which said that the more education women have, the fewer children. And while World War II brought on a spike in divorce, its incidence declined for 2 decades thereafter. The seventh common force behind family renewal and strength has been gender role differentiation, a celebration of the differences in the tasks performed by men and women. The 19th century Victorians in America held in highest honor what they called the Eden Laws. The Eden Laws. These were the moral and religious legacies of the garden, still in force after the fall. God's creation of human marriage, the divine command to be fruitful and multiply, and sexual complementarity in the home. In Sarah Hale's words, man is the worker or provider, the protector and the lawgiver. Woman is the preserver, the teacher or inspirer, and the exemplar. Catherine Beecher believed that this restriction of women to the domestic sphere was, by and large, a political expedient necessary to preserve democracy. In a turbulent society like America, she maintained some form of hierarchy was needed to avoid a war of all against all. In contrast, Sarah Hale linked this sexual division of labor to women's superiority. Genesis 1 and 2 showed woman to be the last work of creation, she explained, the real glory of human nature. In the forming of Eve, as she put it, there were care and protection taken, which were not bestowed on Adam. Men were the prototype, women the finished product. The woman was of finer mold and destined to the more spiritual uses, most especially to the guiding of her husband and children by the aid of divine grace up to the bliss of heaven. The eighth, final, and related factor behind all 4 eras of domestic strength has been an enthusiastic embrace of each family system by the women involved. Forms of soft patriarchy, of Christian male headship were also present, to be sure. But they only worked alongside a forthright acceptance by their female partners in the building of families. Among the Quakers of 18th century Pennsylvania, the quiet leadership of women was evident. For example, a leader of the Quaker migration from Great Britain to America, John Bevan, explained his family's decision to move. And I quote, "My wife had a great inclination to go thither and thought it might be a good place to train up children amongst sober people and to prevent the corruption of them by the loose behavior of youths and the bad example of too many of riper years." The average Quaker woman in America married at age 20, men at age 24, an event that followed a rigorous 2-year engagement. A key Quaker innovation here was creation of the separate women's meeting. This structure grew in part from a belief in the spiritual equality of Quaker men and women, and in part from stress on the importance of mothering to the whole Quaker social system. Women's meetings closely supervised each betrothed couple. In founder George Fox's words, they must teach the younger women, first, to be sober, secondly, to love their husbands, thirdly, to love their children, fourthly, to be discreet, fifthly, to be chaste and keepers of the home. Also, twice during the engagement, the would-be husband had to appear before the assembled women's meeting, alone and powerless, to be grilled about his spiritual and moral life and his economic prospects in this world. Between 1730 and 1780, Quakerism of this sort flourished in Pennsylvania. Large families were again the rule, from 7 to 9 children per household. Writers such as Benjamin Franklin and Hector St. John de Crevecoeur pointed to Quaker farm families as exemplary Americans, producing both industrious and virtuous children and considerable wealth. Meanwhile, in the Chesapeake Bay area, that's Maryland and Virginia, the years 1730 to 1780 produced another extraordinary result. During the prior 100 years, diseases such as malaria and economic troubles made the Chesapeake into something of a death trap among white planters and African American slaves alike. Family life was turbulent, marriages infrequent, births few. However, a flourishing tobacco-based economy in the 18th century produced a dramatically strengthened family system, showing all the signs of the American model. Marriages came early among both groups, that is, both among planters and slaves, and was almost universal among adults. Fertility was high as well. As demographer Robert Wells summarizes, by the 1770s, and I quote, "Black and white women in the South were more like each other than like English women concerning marriage, family roles, and childbearing." Astonishingly, even the vast chasm created by slavery had, in a way, and for a time, been bridged by the American model. So I have described here specific examples of family flourishing during the 4 cycles of family strength. What lay behind periods of decline? Well, the brief answer is that most or all of the 8 common characteristics turned negative, although each in their own way. Family ideologies fell into disfavor. Claims by the individual, moral, sexual, economic, and political, these displaced organic communal claims. Land and homes became harder to acquire. Tenants or renters replaced owners. Equality in household property ownership and wealth withered. Family-centered economies gave way to impersonal markets. The middle class faded, replaced by more of the very rich and the very poor. Politics and law turned against the family. Systems of sex role differentiation broke down. Women turned towards alternatives to the home. In addition, the record suggests that near the end of each period of family strength, a great complacency set in among leadership elites. Family health would be taken for granted. The deliberate and often difficult efforts of persons 2 or 3 generations earlier to build a family-centered order would be forgotten or even mocked and derided. Commonly linked to these changes were retreats from religious involvement, particularly by the men. Well, not too long ago, I described my family cycles thesis to a biblical scholar, and her head nodded. Oh, it's just like the Old Testament. Certainly one theme found in those books is the decline of the Hebrews into disbelief in hedonism, only to be summoned back to the faith and moral order by a new band of prophets. In America, I suggest similar swings have assumed a 4-generation sequence. 2 generations building coherent and strong family systems, and 2 generations turning away from the family piety of their grandparents and great-grandparents. Will American domestic life continue to follow this pattern in the future? Are the well springs of social invention in America still rich enough to launch a new period of family renewal? If they are, we might anticipate another time of family renewal, a return of family strength beginning around 2020. Might this happen? The odds are certainly against it. Our current legal climate is remarkably hostile to the natural family model. Marriage law is especially distressed. The equity feminist demand for complete gender equality dominates virtually every institution in the land. Measures of inequality in property and income are near historic highs. By all accounts, the American middle class is shrinking. All the same, a similar situation prevailed during the 1920s. And gloom about the family was also a dominant emotion in the 1720s and the 1820s. Nonetheless, family renewal occurred. In this light, political scientist Eric Kaufman's 2012 book, Shall the Religious Inherit the Earth?, offers an alternate look at the human future. He is a self-declared secular liberal. Nonetheless, Kaufman argues that, quote, religious fundamentalists are on course to take over the world through demography. Now, he adapts here, I guess you'd say, the early 20th century Protestant term fundamentalist to include Jews, Muslims, and Christians who also allow scriptural teachings on marriage and procreation to affect their behavior. So he's using the term much more broadly than I'm sure the term is used here. The future, he predicts, actually lies with religious communions that remain faithful to the divine command, be fruitful and multiply. These include, he says, he has separate chapters on these groups, American Mormons, Anabaptists, such as the Old Order Amish and the Hutterites, ultra-Orthodox Haredi Jews, Salafi Islamists, who are actually the largest and most rapidly growing group within Islam, quiverful Protestants, and Laestadian Lutherans, a group you probably don't know much about. They inhabit the Northwoods of Finland and are growing rapidly. He might have added Latin Mass Catholics to the mix. As human fertility otherwise falls around the earth, which is in fact occurring, these religious bodies, with total fertility rates of 4 to 9 children born per woman, are already expanding their relative share of national populations. Compounded over 4 generations, the transition would indeed prove staggering. Kaufman concludes, This is the last paragraph in his book. It will be a century or more before the world completes its demographic transition. There is still too much smoke in the air for us to pick out the peaks and valleys of the emerging social order. This much seems certain. Without a new secular liberal ideology to inspire social cohesion, fundamentalism cannot be stopped. The religious shall inherit the earth. Perhaps this phenomenon, while global in Kaufman's telling, will provide the spark to reignite a new family cycle in American social development. If so, fresh and different expressions of the 8 common underlying factors identified here could be anticipated. What specific forms they might take this time, though, is beyond reasonable speculation. Thank you for your time.
Have an opportunity to ask Dr. Carlson some questions. So just some quick ground rules. First of all, if you'll raise your hand, I'll bring you the microphone so that everybody in the room can hear your question. Second, please state your name and where you are from so Dr. Carlson can know with whom he is speaking. And then succinctly state your question so that we can get in as many questions as possible. So anybody have a question?
My name is Nicholas. I'm from Point, Texas, and my question for you is, what effect did Lyndon Johnson's Great Society programs have on the family?
Well, that's a good question. Briefly, I hold and maintain that the American welfare state created during the 1930s, relative to the family, worked pretty well. And this would be from the 1930s until the mid-1960s. The problem with Lyndon Johnson's Great Society is that he took a limited system that actually had some positive family incentives and expanded it, pushed it too far. And what had been positive became negative. And you can see that in areas of welfare policy. You can even see it relative to Social Security. There's actually very good econometric studies looking at how what effect Social Security has on fertility. And a limited system, like we had in the United States from the first act was 1935, up until the mid-1960s, our system was very limited. It was understood to be supplemental, not as the only way people were going to survive. And the data shows that that actually does allow and encourages, seems to encourage larger families among younger people. Johnson pushed it too far. There were dramatic increases in the coverage of Social Security, but also in the amount of tax that was being paid, and so on. Once you pass a certain point, the Social Security, pay-as-you-go Social Security system as we have, becomes negative relative to fertility. Why? Because you can't avoid the taxes, but you can avoid having children. And if you let your neighbor raise the children they're going to pay for your Social Security in the future, you spend your money on having fun, you're well ahead. It's a free rider problem, economists call it. That kicked in the 1960s and 70s. And so Social Security, which I would say had been pro-family prior to that time, became anti-family after.
Thank you so much for your message today. My name is Adam Robinson, originally from Australia. I've been here for about 7 years now. My question was, what was the catalyst, if there was a catalyst, for the current cycle of family weakness in America that we're currently in?
Well, a number. Economic conditions turned against the kind of family I was talking about. The United States economy kind of peaked in the early 1970s, post-war economy. And then we went into a kind of a recession, we went into hyperinflation. Part of the cause was the imbalances caused by the Vietnam War. Part of it was a turn to, we had more competitors suddenly in the world were emerging. And there were some material factors lay behind it. But the most dramatic thing, I think without question, was starting in the mid-1960s, a hostility to the natural family began to emerge among key elites and soon became embedded certainly in the culture and in law. Feminism, radical equity feminism, returned starting in the late 1960s and became dominant in the 1970s. The fear of the population bomb, I remember this very clearly. Paul Ehrlich's book, The Population Bomb from 1969, said that unless we stopped having children altogether, everyone would be starving in about 15 years. And people took that as the gospel truth. The man knew nothing about demography. Actually, he's an insect scientist. But he and similar people advocating population control had a huge effect on my generation who were in college at the time. And that helped to break the cycle of people assuming, well, one of the things I'm going to go do is get married and go have kids. Suddenly, it became virtuous to have no children, or to declare that you were going to have no children. The general sexual revolution broke out of the back alleys of America at the same time. They had been churning underneath, but rising parallel to the radical feminist movement, which rejected marriage and family for its reasons, was the Playboy philosophy. Hugh Hefner suddenly became the philosopher of the time. And he too rejected marriage and children for different reasons, but agreed with the feminists that those were both things to be thrown out. The breakdown of restraints on pornography began to break down at that time. Prior to 1970, pornography, if you got it, was in a back alley somewhere, but suddenly it became very easy to get. And again, the courts facilitated that. So I think unique to that time, and one of the reasons I think the system broke down earlier than it would have otherwise, it should have gone on for another 10 or 15 years, were these factors, this ideological assault on the family coming from a variety of directions, and the almost complete failure of, I'll be frank, of the churches to do much about it. They just kind of rolled over and played dead. I could go into specifics on that, but that's another lecture. But, and also the judges turned against it. Others who should have been there to defend the family system were absent without leave. They just weren't there.
David Shin, currently from Arlington, Texas, down the road here. Just wondering, with the early pioneer and settlements of the U.S. And the recognition of the strong families and stuff, do you see anything in the U.S. Constitution that the Founding Fathers would have written into it to be supportive of the family?
Well, actually, the U.S. Constitution says almost nothing about the family, which makes it kind of unique in the world, because certainly most of the constitutions written in the 20th century all over the world mention family, sometimes quite a bit. Our Constitution doesn't mention family. But there's a reason for that, and I think it was a good reason. The good reason was that it was not something that the federal government would be involved in. The management, the regulation of domestic life, as they would have used the phrase back then, was to be left to the states and local governments. If the family pops up, it's only indirectly in the 9th and 10th Amendments, which limit the federal government, what it can do, and leaves everything else to the states. And the founders were very conscious that they were leaving the regulation of domestic life, marriage law, family law, divorce law, all those things would be left to the states. That was, I think, the right place to put it. What's happened in the 20th century is that these questions have become federalized. And sometimes it worked well for a while. Like I say, I think the American welfare state worked well for a while. The problem was, couldn't leave it alone. Had to continue to tinker with it, mess with it, and it turned negative. And then issues such as abortion, which had been a state regulation, were overturned. Well, first it was contraception, state laws on contraception overturned by the Griswold decision in 1965 by the Supreme Court. Then on abortion by Roe v. Wade in 1973. and a whole string of cases that followed from that, leading up to the Obergefell decision dealing with same-sex marriage. All of these things became federalized, which is exactly the opposite of what the founders wanted. But that's why the word's not there. It's intentional, and I think it was correct. It should have been left to the states.